The 2006 Oaxaca protests, a protracted social conflict analysis by Amanda Hood. The goal of this analysis is to gain a deeper understanding of the preconditions for protracted social conflict that led to the protests in 2006, as well as the actions and events that escalated this peaceful protest into 5 months of extreme state repression against the people of Oaxaca. The history of the 2006 Oaxaca protests. In May 2006, the teachers of the National Education Workers Union, Section 22, in Oaxaca went on strike, as they have done every year for the past 25 years. They demanded improved infrastructure, educational resources, bilingual education, and better wages. However, instead of meeting the demands of striking teachers, the government of Oaxaca sent in over 3,000 police officers to raid the strike and to drive the teachers out of the center of the city. This attack ignited a much larger social and cultural uprising in the state of Oaxaca. On June 17th, the Popular Assembly of the Peoples of Oaxaca, or the APPO for short, formed in response to the state violence. The members of APPO took over the center of the city and declared themselves the governing body of Oaxaca. APPO considered themselves a leaderless assembly, where all members made decisions through the process of consensus and other indigenous governing traditions. APPO was made up of over 365 organizations, including unions, indigenous rights groups, municipalities, community, and human rights organizations. The APPO demanded the immediate resignation of Governor Ruiz Ortiz of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or the PRI. Governor Ruiz refused to resign, and in response to this decision, members of the APPO took over municipal offices, blockaded the streets, and set up encampments to protest the state corruption and repression. APPO organized marches of over 500,000 people demanding the resignation of Governor Ruiz, the end to state repression, and the call for a new constitution. On August 1st, over 3,000 women marched through the city of Oaxaca with pots and pans, demanding that Ruiz resign. The Women's March was planned a few nights earlier, in response to the growing need for women's leadership and voice within the uprising. APPO's leadership was largely male, and the women demanded their place within the movement by reclaiming the tools, pots and pans, of women's work. That same day, the women continued marching to the government-owned public TV station Channel 9 to demand an hour on the air to tell the truth about Ruiz, the PRI, and the state of repression in Oaxaca. The station would not allow them this time, so they took it over peacefully and started broadcasting. The role of media was crucial within the Oaxacan protests, and the government and police attacks escalated because of this. As state and federal violence was increasing, the people of Oaxaca started their march to Mexico City on September 21st. Over 4,000 people set out on the march to demand freedom from repression and violence. During this time, leaders of the Teachers Union Section 22 were in continual negotiations to try and reach a settlement for the teachers to go back to school. Violence by the state continued to escalate, and on October 12th, a subcommission of the Federal Senate was in Oaxaca to determine the status of governability. As the people of Oaxaca continued to organize, the assassinations, disappearances, and police attacks continued. By late October, many teachers were back in school. Towards the final weeks of November and December, the encampments in the center of the city were raided, and members of the APPO sought refuge in the university. After 5 long months, the federal government and the state of Oaxaca murdered, detained, and disappeared hundreds of activists. The government captured leaders of the movement and brought them up on legal charges in an effort to create division and to end the movement. The theory used to analyze the 2006 Oaxaca protests is by professor and conflict resolver Edward Azar. Edward Azar's protracted social conflict theory states that there are 4 factors or preconditions that must be present for protracted social conflict to occur. including communal context, deprivation of basic needs, governance and the state's role, and international linkages. He acknowledges that a protracted social conflict does not require all four of these factors. However, all four are found within the conflict in Oaxaca. The role of the communal or identity group within the conflict in Oaxaca is crucial to understanding the conflict. More than half of the population of Oaxaca are indigenous people from over 16 ethnic and linguistic groups, with an estimated 37% of the population who don't speak Spanish. Even though these indigenous groups make up so much of the population, they have continued to be excluded from having a role in politics within Oaxaca. In addition to the political exclusion indigenous communities faced, institutionalized racism and discrimination is rampant within Oaxaca, spanning over 500 years with the colonization of Mexico by the Spanish. Because of the effects of colonization and violence, the indigenous communities and people continue to be among the poorest in the country. This treatment and exclusion of the indigenous people of Oaxaca fueled the 2006 protests. The deprivation of basic needs is another important factor within the uprisings and protests in Oaxaca. Azar's protracted social conflict theory describes a basic need as anything that is non-negotiable and can lead to intense and oftentimes violent conflict. Oaxaca is one of the poorest states in Mexico, and the teachers are considered to be some of the poorest in the country. Additionally, a large percentage of Oaxacan people struggle with malnutrition and perpetual hunger. State repression is rampant, and there's a lack of basic political rights, including freedom of speech, freedom of press, and security for political dissent. With the rise in international business in Oaxaca, good jobs and union wages were decimated, and natural resources depleted and polluted. Oaxaca also has one of the biggest tourist industries in the country. The international wealth of the tourism industry contrasts sharply with the continued poverty, hunger, lack of access to quality education, racism, and discrimination that continues to plague the people of Oaxaca. The increase of state and federal violence and repression during the protests only further exacerbated the APPO struggle for the free media and overall security. The role of the state also played a critical role in the escalation of conflict within Oaxaca. The PRI was the only single political party in power for the past 70 years. The PRI was known for its corruption and repressive rule. Many people in Oaxaca believe that Governor Ruiz and the PRI murdered his opponents and committed election fraud in the 2004 elections. Ruiz's government and political party were seen as illegitimate in the eyes of the people. In addition to this illegitimacy, the PRI and Ruiz were known for mass corruption and embezzlement. Ruiz funneled state dollars into the next PRI leader's campaign. He attempted to cover up the missing money by damaging public spaces and allocating funding to repair them. Many of these public spaces remain destroyed. In order to maintain the corruption and status quo of a few political elites in Oaxaca, Governor Ruiz's rule was authoritarian and relied on extreme repression of dissent, limitations on free media, and discrimination. The style was apparent in his responses to the 2006 protests and contributed to the escalation of violence and deaths of his people. Towards the end of the 5 months, the federal government became increasingly more involved in the repression and violence within Oaxaca out of fear for its own political downfall. The final factor of Azar's protracted social conflict theory, international linkages, played a critical role in the ever-growing level of poverty, hunger, and lack of basic needs and rights. With the formation of NAFTA in 1994, the Mexican economy has worsened and created even deeper levels of inequality within the country. Originally, many government officials saw NAFTA as a chance to strengthen the economy of Mexico. However, NAFTA has had a devastating effect on Mexico and the agricultural community of Oaxaca. Under NAFTA, trade barriers were lowered, causing a mass influx of U.S. exports. Mexican subsidies were eliminated, and the state franchised and subsidized CONF stores were abolished. Also, former laws designed to save small farmers and guarantee the sale of local products were now eliminated by the free trade agreements. In December 1994, Mexico could not survive the world market, and the peso was devalued, leading to the collapse of the Mexican economy. Because of the devastation to the Mexican economy by NAFTA, the country and states received loans and bailout packages from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The U.S. Treasury supplied a $20 billion loan backed by bonds from U.S. banks, and in order to pay back this loan, Mexico promised the country's oil revenue. The oil revenues were Mexico's primary source of income, thus creating the lack of resources for social programs and the people of Mexico. The effects of NAFTA in Oaxaca were shocking. Oaxaca was home to over 85,000 varieties of corn, but the local markets were flooded with corn from the United States, and it was impossible for the unsubsidized farmers of Oaxaca to compete with the U.S. subsidized companies. Many farmers from Oaxaca were starving and continued to migrate to the U.S. to provide for their families. Additionally, the government continues to cut subsidies for gas, electricity, milk, and tortillas, and transportation. Because of these dramatic rises in prices, the elimination of unions, and the devastation of local farming, the wealth gap has increased exponentially, leaving people behind and increasing the chances of ongoing violence. In addition to the role of NAFTA, many actions of the federal government increased the level of repression and violence within Oaxaca during the 2006 protests. As the state violence and propaganda was increasing, Mexican President Vincent Fox was finishing the last part of his presidential term. The conditions and uprisings in Oaxaca posed a political threat to national governance. If Governor Ruiz could not establish law and order within Oaxaca, the rest of the country was at risk for similar dissent. Even though all four factors are present, the conflict is more dependent on the dynamics of three group determinants. 1. Communal actions and strategies, 2. State actions and strategies, and 3. Built-in mechanisms of conflict. These determinants examine how identity groups form, how they organize themselves, the state's actions, and the built-in mechanisms that causes the conflict to escalate and spiral. These three groups of determinants are important in the escalation of repression and violence within Oaxaca. The APPO and protesters organized largely based on indigenous governing structures. These governance structures eliminated secret voting procedures and instead held open meetings for discussion and governing by consensus. In addition to these actions, their main goal was the resignation of Governor Ruiz to create an ungovernable state. These actions, ideologies, and the sheer numbers of the APPO triggered a more authoritarian and repressive response from the state of Oaxaca. Throughout the 5 months of protests, the state's tactics became increasingly more violent, including raids, assassinating activists, and destroying media outlets. These tactics and actions triggered the spiral of conflict escalation, reigniting the history of repression as well as the colonization of the region by the Spanish 500 years ago. It is important to note that the conflict in Oaxaca did not begin or end in 2006. These factors for protracted social conflict were established long before the protests and continue in some form today. Even though the protests did not fix the decades of political corruption, repression, or poverty, they changed the social and political climate within Oaxaca. The 2006 protests created a space for all people to struggle for a voice, to have control over the media, and the power to overcome the fear to organize for social change. The APPO looked beyond the demand for Governor Ruiz's resignation and formed a statewide council of over 250 representatives to continue the work of identifying better ways for governance, media participation, equality, and a new constitution. In the 2010 elections, for the first time in over 70 years, the PRI lost the state elections. Smaller protests and uprisings continue today, and in order to prevent future violence and to help build the society that protesters demonstrated for, it is crucial to address the structural and cultural components of the conflict. This work will need to be done in participation with the Oaxacan people at the grassroots level rather than excluding them. They must be seen as agents of change. There also needs to be legal recognition and justice for the deaths of protesters by the state. The 2006 protests made it clear that there needs to be a restructuring of governance systems and further participation and leadership by indigenous and grassroots organizations to build a strong state capable of allowing change and dissent. Oaxaca and all of Mexico needs to adopt a multicultural and multilingual identity to recognize the history and culture of indigenous groups. The federal government needs to return the subsidies to the state for basic needs such as food, and they need to support and build grassroots programs to address the overwhelming poverty. More space for creative acts and community radio and news will be crucial in overcoming the decades of silence and repression. As stated before, it is crucial that the people are able to participate as agents of change within the peace-building efforts in order to eliminate future violence and to help the state overcome the protracted conflict still taking place within Oaxaca today.